let's go ahead and do that. Let me, do you have a MacBook?
No, I don't have anything on me.
I don't know, I'm saying in general, do you use one?
Yes, I did. Oh, yeah, I do.
How do I make sure it doesn't go dark?
You just, it will,
No.
oh, you mean it doesn't? Oh, let me look this up.
Where's that at?
How to make sure
Energy saver.
MacBook does not sleep.
Oh, here we go. Never.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, you're tech savvy.
Sometimes. All right, let's go grab that. Backdrop for last because sometimes I'll ask you to take things down. But we figured if we waited until it started.
Got it.
Well, we couldn't say that.
We don't have room to set this up.
Yeah, we do. We can move this forward.
She's definitely, yeah, changed
Thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Micah Veo, and I'm an Associate Programs Officer with the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and we are incredibly grateful that you came, and we're happy to host you here. I want to begin by thanking the Diana Davis Spencer Foundation for helping make this possible, and of course our debaters, Ross and Kim, and then our moderator, Leah. Before we begin, though, I'd like to say a few words about who we are at ISI and what we do. It is our mission to provide a forum for civic discussion on the problems and the questions that define an entire generation of students. From us, students receive incisive educational programming on topics including technology, economics, art, religion, politics, philosophy, history, and culture. And while we try always to keep our brand product fresh and our education fresh through providing the tools to wrestle with contemporary dilemmas, we also do want to immerse our students in the permanent things. We point to the path that leads to truth, goodness, and beauty, a path that every human heart must journey. That's why we exist. We see a future of ordered liberty, cultural renewal, economic prosperity and justice, technological innovation that serves humanity, and most importantly of all, civic virtue. We want our students to be prepared upon graduation to navigate what it means to be a virtuous citizen in these United States. If this sounds like something that you're interested in or want to be a part of in any way, please come find me afterward. But thank you for coming to this debate. Is assisted dying moral? I'll now introduce Walker Stewart, who is the president of the Rene Girard Society here at Stanford. Without them, this wouldn't be possible. We wouldn't be able to have this space, so we're very grateful to them. And he's going to come up here and introduce our speakers. So thank you all for coming.
Well, thank you, Micah, and thank you, everyone, for being here. We'd like to thank ISI for their generous support and help for both putting this event on and for a lot of the other activities that are going on at Stanford. So my name is Walker Stewart. I'm a senior here at Stanford, and I'm involved in the Girard Society. I'm the editor emeritus of the Stanford Review, and I'm the president of the Stanford Students for Life. So this evening, as Micah mentioned, the speakers will be debating the resolution, Is Assisted Dying Moral? So arguing in the affirmative is Kim Callanan. So a brief introduction for Kim. She has served on the Compassion and Choices leadership team for the past 8 years, first as Chief Program Officer and for the past 5 years as the organization's President and Chief Executive Officer. During her combined tenure at Compassion and Choices, Kim has played a leadership role in authorizing and implementing medical aid in dying in 6 new jurisdictions, including the recent passage of New Mexico's End of Life Options Act. Kim frequently speaks at conferences, testifies before state legislatures, conducts policy briefings, and serves on committees as subject matter expert on end-of-life care options. So without further ado, Kim Callanan. Arguing in the negative is Ross Douthat. Ross Douthat joined the New York Times as an opinion columnist in April of 2009, and his opinion column appears every Tuesday and Sunday. He is also a host on the weekly opinion podcast, Matter of Opinion. He is the author of 6, or as he said earlier, 5.5 books, including The Deep Places, which is about finding meaning in suffering. And previously, he was a senior editor at The Atlantic and a blogger on its website. So, Ross Douthat. And moderating this evening's debate is Leah Sargent. She is a former atheist who converted to Catholicism in 2012, and her writing has appeared in the New York Times, First Things, and 538. She also runs Other Feminisms, a Substack community focused on interdependence. So Leah will be our moderator this evening. And to introduce more on the format of this evening's debate, I will hand it off to Leah to talk about how things will run. So here she is. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to give a quick outline of how our debate will be conducted and to reassure you there will be audience questions, but at the proper time. We're going to start with a 10-minute opening speech from each of our debaters. We'll start with Kim, move on to Ross. They'll each be given an opportunity for a 2-minute rebuttal, compacting the entirety of what's wrong with their opponent's argument into those 2 minutes. And then there will be approximately 25 minutes of questions moderated by me, my questions. And I should explain that as a debate moderator, I have 2 roles. One is a sort of an air traffic control operator, making sure people get up and get down at the proper time, making sure no one gets too enthusiastic about an interpretation of 10 minutes, which is why I've brought a gavel. But I trust these debaters a lot, and my secondary role as moderator is, I think, to be an advocate for the audience. So my questions are aimed at exploring the roots of the disagreement, whereas in a debate, it's often easy to aim purely at the weakest point of your opponent's argument and perhaps pass over a weakness you both share or a strength you both think you share that is unexamined. My role as moderator is to push on the roots of what divides people and help advocate for you, the audience, in exploring the heart of the debate. After that, there will be time for 25 to 30 minutes of questions from the audience. The shorter and more cogent your question, the more of them I can take. So please consider writing your question down just for your own reference to help crystallize your thought before I call on you. We'll close with closing remarks, first from Ross, then from Kim, and then release you back out into the night. And I'll say it's a real privilege to moderate this debate because I'm always interested in the use of an adversarial collaboration, which is what a debate is, to explore what's true. And I've moderated a wide range of debates on topics, but when I moderate a debate on foreign policy, I'm less confident that the audience is going to put what they learned in this debate into action, possibly in the next few days. I think this debate presents a real challenge to everyone here. At the end of the night, there will be a vote on where you are at the end versus where you were at the beginning. But I think the real vote is going to be taken in how you all approach the end of your lives and the people you most love. So with that, Ms. Callan.
No pressure.
Good evening. Thank you to the Intercollegiate Studies Institute and Leah, Michael, Ross, for what I'm sure will be a respectful discussion. Today, we're examining the morality of the current United States framework for assisted dying, also known as medical aid in dying, which is the terminology I'll use throughout. I take the position that not only are U.S. medical aid in dying laws moral, but they are aligned with the ISI Institute's core principles and virtues. To clarify, we must start with a common understanding of the specifics of U.S. assisted dying laws and set aside inaccurate and misleading comparisons to other countries like Canada and the Netherlands, which have dramatically different healthcare, political, and judicial systems, as well as assisted dying laws. In the United States, medical aid in dying laws codify a very carefully regulated medical practice with strict safeguards. They allow a person who is already going to die the ability to avoid the very worst, the very last part of the dying process. Specifically, to be eligible for medical aid in dying, you must be an adult who is terminally ill with a prognosis of 6 months or less to live. You must be mentally capable of making an informed healthcare decision, and the dying person is in charge of the process from start to finish. They must make the request multiple times, and they must take an affirmative step to administer the medication if they decide to do so. 2 healthcare providers must agree that a person meets the eligibility criteria and is doing this on their own volition. In every state, there are at least a dozen regulatory requirements, including written and verbal requests, witness attestations, and waiting periods. Furthermore, every medical aid in dying statute in the United States explicitly makes assisted suicide and euthanasia illegal. Medical aid in dying is entirely optional for both the provider and the patient. Nobody is forced to participate. The laws are simply about allowing a person who is already going to die the ability to avoid the very worst part of the dying process. Today, more than 1 in 5 people in the United States have access to medical aid in dying across 10 states, 9 states, and Washington, D.C. Plus, it's 10 states plus Washington, D.C. Based on the data from these states, including over a quarter of a century of empirical data from Oregon, which was the first state to authorize this option, we have a very robust body of evidence surrounding medical aid in dying. And the evidence is clear. Medical aid in dying provides peace of mind to the dying person, alleviates unnecessary suffering, and protects vulnerable populations. Not a single incidence of abuse or coercion has been substantiated in the decades of time medical aid in dying has been authorized across these 10 jurisdictions. Just a few weeks ago, a Trump-appointed federal judge dismissed a California lawsuit that challenged the constitutionality of medical aid in dying laws in California. In his dismissal, the judge specifically noted that the significant hurdles in the law make abuse and coercion implausible and unforeseeable. Laws, however, aren't just words on paper. They have a profound impact on our society. As you think about the morality of medical aid in dying, consider these 2 stories. The first one is of Ayla Earhart, a 23-year-old gifted ballet dancer from Manhattan, whose world was forever altered when she found out the sores on her tongue and persistent pain in her neck was squamous cell carcinoma. She did rounds of aggressive treatment, 30 treatments in 30 business days, chemotherapy and immunotherapy. Yet her cancer continued to metastasize. When there was no more options left, she enrolled in hospice care. More than once, Ayla cried out in pain, asking for the option of medical aid in dying. However, she lived in New York, so medical aid in dying was unavailable. Despite that she was being treated at one of the best palliative care programs in the nation, Mount Sinai, doctors were unable to control her pain. After months of futile treatment and unsuccessful attempts to mitigate her pain, Ayla finally died in her hospital bed, experiencing the anguish and pain she had hoped to avoid. In stark contrast was the death of Brittany Menard. Brittany was battling debilitating headaches when she discovered she had brain cancer at the young age of 29. Married for just over a year to Dan Diaz, who's actually with us in the audience today, there he is. Their lives were suddenly consumed by hospital visits, medical consultations, and initially the pursuit of treatment. Despite surgery and aggressive treatments, her tumor returned, more vicious than before. Brittany was going to die. At the time, she lived in the state, she was in California, and at the time, California did not authorize medical aid in dying. However, she and Dan and her family had the time and the means to move to Oregon to access their medical aid in dying law. With considerable effort and support, Brittany navigated the very complicated and lengthy process to reestablish residency, a process that few at life's end have the time, energy, or resources to do. The mere possession of the medication when she finally got it brought Brittany profound peace of mind. She lived her final months to the fullest, immersing herself in nature, going to various different federal parks and state parks, and making memories with her loved ones. However, just like Ayla, eventually Brittany's condition worsened. In Brittany's case, though, she had access to medical aid in dying, so she was able to avoid that horrific suffering that Ayla experienced. While in her husband Dan's arms, with her loved ones surrounding her, Brittany took her medical aid in dying prescription and ended her suffering. Within minutes, she drifted into a peaceful sleep, and about 30 minutes later, her breathing slowed until she passed gently into the night. The stories of Ayla and Brittany reinforce the morality and the need for medical aid in dying. Both young women faced their terminal diagnoses with courage, undergoing treatment in hospice in the hopes of a miracle, yet both were taken from this world far too soon. Brittany, who had the opportunity to decide the timing and manner of her departure, passed away, leaving behind memories filled with peace and closure with her family. Imagine how you would feel if you were Ayla's parents and you were forced to stand bedside and watch your daughter suffering, crying out, asking for you to help, and being unable to do anything. Ayla's parents continue to advocate for the option of medical aid in dying in her home state of New York, hoping that nobody else has to go through the trauma that Ayla and they experienced at life's end. How one dies matters, not just to the dying person, but to those who are left behind. These contrasting outcomes highlight the morality of medical aid in dying laws and demonstrate that medical aid in dying laws are not just moral, but they are necessary. They also happen to be consistent with the ISI's 6 core principles. The first, limited government. The story of Ayla's death is a great example of what happens when government unduly infringes upon personal decisions, how one dies. To be consistent with the ISI value of limited government, the dying person, not the government, should get to decide how much pain is too much. Second, individual liberty. Both stories are a testament to the importance of personal liberty at life's end. By legalizing medical aid in dying in every state, society affirms our commitment to prioritizing one's individual liberty. Third, personal responsibility involves taking ownership over decisions and their outcomes. What we see time and time again, and you saw in Brittany's example, is the actual construct of medical aid in dying laws ensures that personal liberty is taking place because people are in active discussions with their healthcare providers and with their family members about what they want the end of life to look like. It is a model of personal responsibility. The rule of law ensures that justly applied laws guide our society. And as noted above, medical aid in dying statutes are voluntary for doctors and patients, and they include meticulous safeguards that protect everyone that is involved. Medical aid in dying aligns with a society that values free market principles, as it offers individuals a broader range of care options. Furthermore, if medical aid in dying were legalized in every state in the nation, market forces would allow for the most efficient delivery of end-of-life care. And finally, is Judeo-Christian values. While there's no question that medical aid in dying is inconsistent with Catholic theology, when you look at the broader set of Judeo-Christian values that the ISI purports, medical aid in dying is in line with Judeo-Christian values. As Father Louis Bariso, an Episcopal pastor, says, as a priest, I have been blessed to counsel many as they prepare for the end of their lives. My God is a God of love and compassion, a God who would not abandon a dying person who is suffering and refuse that person the means to die peacefully. Acknowledging that modern medicine has long been used to extend life beyond its natural course, we must, as a society, we have a moral obligation to offer individuals the means to ease their end-of-life suffering. In closing, I stand with the 7 out of 10 Americans who support medical aid in dying, including 64% of conservatives, 71% of moderates, and 83% of Democrats, according to a recent national bipartisan poll conducted by Goodwin-Simon with the support of Susquehanna Polling and Research. When implemented with strident safeguards, as they have been here in the United States, medical aid in dying laws represent not a challenge to our morality, but an affirmation of the compassionate and respectful society we strive to be in, one that honors individual liberty and alleviates unnecessary suffering, and is consistent with the ISI's core mission of making America free and prosperous. In closing, as you're thinking about the debate, I encourage you to hear the words of California Governor Edmund Brown when he was signing the paper. He is a Catholic, and he actually was a seminarian. And what he said was, I don't know what I would do if I were dying in prolonged and excruciating pain. I am certain, however, that it would be a comfort to be able to consider the options afforded by this bill, and I wouldn't deny that right to others. Thank you.
Should we shake hands? We can shake hands again at the end. All right. I live in fear of Leia's gavel, so I'm going to set a timer just for myself. Anyway, thank you all so much for being here. Thanks to ISI, thanks to our moderator, thanks to my debating partner. I'm confident this will be an interesting argument back and forth. Might be a little too much pressure to say that we're setting in motion how all of you think about end-of-life care, but it's good. No pressure. So I'm just going to make, I think there's two ways that we could think about the resolve or the question that we're presented with here tonight. We could think about assisted dying's morality as the morality of a legal and social system, a set of regulations and expectations, and we can think about the morality of the act itself. And I think in certain ways the easier way to argue my position in the debate is to focus on the first question, the question of the system and its implications for society, for old age, for illness, for medical treatment, for debates about public spending, insurance, a whole range of forces and factors. And it's slightly harder to make the second argument, in part because I, in fact, agree with the comments about the extent to which assisted dying fits with certain conceptions of individualism and individual liberty that are pretty deeply woven into the American character. And there's a reason, I think, that you have majorities of Americans in a lot of polls express some kind of support for some version of assisted dying. But I'm going to try and take on the harder point after beginning with maybe the slightly easier argument to make. And the slightly easier argument to make, I think, is that it is very difficult to design a broad, comprehensive, morally consistent system of medical aid in dying that is not amenable to overexpansion and abuse. And I want to concede up front that I think the ways in which these programs have been implemented in the United States in about 1 out of every 5 states to date have been more effective at curtailing severe abuses than the systems implemented in some European countries, and particularly in our neighbor to the north in Canada, where medical aid in dying in Canada has rapidly and remarkably expanded the number of people taking advantage of it, and there's been a sort of substantial debate about the extent to which that expansion has encompassed a lot of people who are in mental distress or financial distress, who clearly would be better suited receiving treatment and support rather than an offer of some form of assisted suicide. I think the systems that we have in place in the United States have not reached that kind of point. I also think, however, that they've not reached that kind of point precisely because they have been held in check by suspicion, hostility, residual Judeo-Christian morality and skepticism about suicide, that a system of sort of cultural and structural checks that I think would be unlikely to survive in the same way if medical aid in dying was accepted and normalized on a nationwide basis, and simply became sort of woven into the everyday life of the entire American healthcare system, which is not noted in every case for its deep responsiveness to the condition of the individual patient. And I think that you can, I think, again, just by looking at examples from other countries, can easily see the challenges involved in managing such a system and making determinations about sort of what sound in their descriptions like simple, sort of medical expertise weighing in on people's intentionality and their certainty and their freedom of choice, and all of these issues, where in fact, in reality, across the range of human experiences, you get a lot of different people in a lot of different circumstances who, in confrontation or interaction with a bureaucratized healthcare apparatus, the US has one kind of bureaucratized healthcare apparatus, Canada has a different one, but I think it's very, very easy to see how many edge cases can be sort of end up, let's say, treated in inappropriate ways, with people feeling in different ways a certain kind of social pressure and social expectation to take the less burdensome, less expensive, less time-consuming approach to an end of life, the way that different family dynamics and complexities can enter into these situations, and the way that mental competency and issues of depression, unhappiness, in all its varied forms, make it incredibly difficult to have, I think, any kind of certainty that in every case you're going to actually be taking all of the proper precautions and protecting the system from all forms of abuse. And I think that, if you imagine this extending forward over a period in which the United States of America, like every developed rich society in the world, is going to be facing, acute spending crises around healthcare, an aging population, and various burdens on the system, I think it really kind of defies belief that you're going to manage a large-scale system that presents options for people to end their life fairly precipitously without yielding various kinds of abuse. And I think, I think that the challenge for the medical aid in dying movement in certain ways is that it takes the circumstances of the United States 1975 to 2025, where it is presenting a novel idea joined to deeply sympathetic cases and achieving sort of modest incremental forms of change, and imagines that that is how the system would continue to work over the next 50 to 75 years in an increasingly elderly country with an increasingly overstretched healthcare system, in an environment where, again, this would cease to be seen as a sort of unusual set of exceptions and would become, as it has become in Canada and parts of Europe, a sort of normal, expected, and from there a sort of form of pressure placed upon people at the end of life. I think that's, the sort of big picture reason to be skeptical of this approach to end-of-life care as a system, even if you think that it is moral in individual cases. On the deeper issue, though, right, is that the lines that are drawn in order to prevent that kind of comprehensive abuse are themselves pretty obviously philosophically arbitrary and hard to defend as sort of a consistent view of what is moral and what is just for human beings, right? And I think fundamentally, you have to ask, what are the reasons, right, that we do not when someone presents themselves without a terminal diagnosis, as seeking suicide, desiring to end their life, whether they're a teenager or a middle-aged man or anyone else. What are the reasons that we put up roadblocks and impediments and don't treat those desires as equivalent to the desires of someone in the last 6 months of life facing a terminal diagnosis? And I think, again, there's a kind of intuitive sense that, okay, there's this sort of exceptional zone where you're approaching the end of life, approaching death, where the normal rules don't apply. But the normal rules that we maintain as a society are based on the premise not just sort of the religious idea that every human life is sacred, and there it is. I'll just say 30 seconds more. But on the premise that that most people are not in a position, in a kind of godlike position, to know with any kind of certainty what awaits them at the end of a period of suffering, what a period of suffering means, what the shape and scope of their future actually looks like. And this is why, if someone presents themselves as a 37-year-old and says, I am suffering from chronic pain, for instance, that the medical system has no sort of mechanism to deal with, and I'm confronting another 50 years of life with this condition, I am in a worse position than someone with only 6 months to live, because I face a sort of, a much longer period of potential pain and suffering. We don't say to them, go ahead, end your life. We attempt to prevent them from ending their life, because the assumption is that they are not in a position to know fully the full story of their life, basically. That is, in certain ways, the primary argument against allowing people to kill themselves. And I think in the end, it obtains, even in the last 6 months of life, as much as it obtains in the 42nd year of your life, or the 13th year of your life, or the 51st year of your life. And so I guess that's the primary question that I would put to my interlocutor here tonight, is to define a clear and consistent moral principle that separates someone's desire to die facing, let's say, 30 years of suffering from someone's desire to die facing 4 to 6 months of suffering. What is the core distinction that we as a society would make that would say medical aid in dying is moral for someone facing a terminal condition and immoral for everyone else, no matter what degree of suffering they expect to face in their life going forward? Sorry for running long.
Thank you so much. We're going to have 2-minute rebuttals. Yes, thank you. From each speaker. I have a very comfortable chair, so I think I'll try and give a little tap warning when you've hit the 2 minutes, and then try and wrap up from there. Right. So it's a little hard.
And we'll just stay seated after that,
and
right?
after that, you'll be seated for the conversation. Go for it.
Well, thank you so much for that question, because in my mind, there is a really clear distinction. And that distinction is that when someone is already going to die with a prognosis of 6 months or less to live, they're eligible for what's known as hospice care. And hospice care is when you have to forego treatments in order to cure and save your life, and instead it's about keeping you comfortable and allowing you to die in a manner that's consistent with your own values. Medical aid in dying, as defined in the United States, allows people who are eligible for hospice care an alternative of not dragging on that their dying process, but instead being able to be in control of it, which gives them a profound sense of comfort and peace at the end of their lives, and allows them to live the end of their lives to their fullest, giving them a chance to say goodbye to their loved ones, because they know that ultimately they have control if their suffering becomes too great. So the distinction between the two is very clear. If you are not at the very end of your life and already going to die, what we want to do is give you all available care so that you're able to get the treatment that you deserve within our healthcare system. But if you're already going to die, to force you to continue to suffer is unconscionable. So that answers Ross's first question. to talk about the impact that medical aid and dying laws have on the broader society, what I'd like to say is actually the way the US medical aid and dying laws have been implemented is that they actually protect us from exactly what Ross is concerned about. Because in the US, we very clearly have made the laws be about personal autonomy. The person is in charge of the process from start to finish. The person is making the decision. So the impacts of other people have not happened, which is as Ross has identified, and they won't, because as we've authorized medical aid and dying, we have also explicitly made euthanasia illegal. We have said we will not allow in this country, the option of a third party administering a legal dose of medication to somebody else. That has been made illegal, and that's what's taking place in these other countries where Ross refers to the slippery slope. So we do have a really tightly regulated construct, which is what ensures that medical aid and dying laws will remain here in the United States protected, to protect our vulnerable populations. We also know that fewer than 1% of people choose the option of medical aid and dying. It's a very, very small percentage, and it has remained that way over the 25 years that Oregon has had the law, and it's been consistent in every other state. So this idea that somehow it's going to apply to mass numbers of people, it's just not a reality. Even as the population ages, it's not a reality of what will happen with medical aid and dying laws, because we've seen the population aging and we've remained pretty steady at the fewer than 1%. At the end of the day, what we see with medical aid and dying laws is it's really not about how one dies, but it's about how one wants to live the final chapter of their lives. And there was a woman who came up to me today, I don't know if you're there, and she introduced herself to me, and she thanked me. And she said, I'm here as a cancer patient. And one of the things that has given me a profound sense of comfort is knowing that I can continue to live my life and fight and go on and have great quality of life, and that I live in a state where at the moment my suffering becomes too great and I can no longer have any quality of life, I have an option. And that's ultimately why I do the work and why I believe that medical aid and dying is not only moral, but it's necessary. Thank you.
So I'm gonna keep asking questions, I guess, and then we can
For 2 minutes.
For 2 minutes, right? I think that, again, I don't actually think that the definitions that you offered quite answered my question. I guess I would put it this way, right? So I guess what I would like you to do is concede that there is an inherent arbitrariness to your definition of who is dying and what constitutes the kind of unbearable pain that legitimizes a life being taken, right? Because certainly someone can be, I mean, for instance, my stepmother-in-law was given a prognosis of having 6 months to live 13 months ago, right? So, I mean, all sort of immediate prognoses, she's still alive, I should say. All immediate prognoses, right, of how long people have to live are inherently uncertain and fraught with uncertainty, right? So stipulating someone has 6 months to live and suddenly they enter into this zone where they have a right that we withhold from everyone else, right, is essentially sort of defining and circumscribing a particular form of individual liberty under the highly uncertain estimates of medical professionals, which seems like an odd way for an individual liberty to exist. Not an impossible way, right? But at the very least different from the other kind of liberties that we take for granted in the United States. And I also, again, am not clear on why the person in this circumstance is in a more vulnerable and tragic situation where the capacity to end pain and suffering is more important than someone who faces a comparable amount of pain and suffering without a certain cure, which, yes, of course, it'd be lovely if our medical system had cures for every condition, but it obviously doesn't. There are many people who experience profound forms of pain and suffering, mental and physical, that go on for years and years and years without resolution. I guess I'm just unclear on what allowing for the deep sympathy one can have for someone in the particular situation of having 4 months to live. I'm unclear on why they are deserving of more protection for their own self-determination than someone facing 10 years of similar suffering or an open-ended period of similar suffering who would like to end their life.
And that brings us into the position where I am the gatekeeper of questions. So I will pick that up a little so you could run with that. Because when I hear you telling stories, what it sounds like your stories are centered on is the suffering, right? And the confidence the suffering will not end more than the exact span of life left to the person. When you talk about the cancer patient who approached you, it wasn't, know that when the suffering comes and I'm estimated to have 5 months and 29 days or fewer left of it, I'll be able to do something. So for you, is it about the control of being able to say no to suffering, and then the time limit in the hospice is about a way of making a legal container that's sustainable? Or do you think of that, estimate of time left as important as the suffering?
So that's a great question. So I think the distinction is whether or not the person is already going to die. That for me, it is immoral and inhumane to force a person to endure needless suffering when death is imminent. The 6-month mark is tied with hospice care, so that a person, you're not giving the person the option of medical aid in dying without also giving them the option for care that could potentially alleviate that suffering. But ultimately, when you're at the very end of your life, the suffering can be really, really extensive. And your body starts to decline in really incredible ways. And having the autonomy to be able to decide when is suffering too much gives a person incredible amount of peace of mind and control. And how one dies really does matter. So if you stand bedside with somebody who is going through that excruciating pain and you are able to support them with their wishes, that's fundamentally what the core principle of medical aid in dying is. It's about personal autonomy and the ability to be empowered and in control at life's end.
I want to ask a follow-up here to really zoom in on that question of needless suffering. Is the thing that makes it needless in the case of terminal cancer that an end is coming and it might come sooner and no treatment is available? I'm thinking of the example recently profiled in the New York Times Magazine of a woman who was seeking medical aid in dying for anorexia, where she had the expectation after repeatedly seeking treatment that she wasn't going to get better, but also that she probably wasn't going to die unless she succeeded in starving herself all the way to death, right? Is her suffering needful in a way the cancer patient's is supererogatory?
I think the distinction is whether or not treatments are available that would cure that person and return them to a state that gives them quality of life. So there is a quality versus quality of life factor that goes into it. And ultimately, medical aid and dying laws are about the person deciding how much suffering is too much. And that's what's important about it.
All right, and then there's one more follow-up, then I promise Ross is getting the same treatment. If it's about irreversibility is kind of the criteria I'm hearing come out there, as well as imminence of death. I think the category of people who are sometimes advocates for medical aid in dying, especially in other countries who haven't succeeded here, are people facing the irreversible decline of Alzheimer's or Huntington's or dementia, where they feel quality of life will have declined. There's no plausible treatment that will reverse it. And rather than being as physically present to the suffering of pain, they have the suffering of knowing that, in some cases, people describe it as having died, but my body keeps going, or, being unable to stop yourself from yelling at or hitting your wife. And it sounds like that hits some of the criteria you're talking about for justice in medical aid and dying: autonomy, self-determination, in terms of defining quality of life, and irreversibility, no hope of things getting better. But requiring it to be self-administered explicitly excludes those people, and I'm curious why. Why is their claim less than the other claim?
Well, I think that that the construct that would be available to people in that situation is not something that is supportable. So they don't have mental competency to be able to make an informed decision, so that personal responsibility piece that's there. They're not immediately going to die. So for that reason, the medical aid and dying laws here in the United States are very strictly regulated around those people who are already going to die. And for people in other situations, there are other, mechanisms that are available to them. But for medical aid and dying as an option, that mental capacity and that personal responsibility are essential.
Ross, it's your turn.
Yes.
You framed the core of your argument as being about uncertainty, both the kind of obvious uncertainty if we don't actually know who is dying at any particular moment, that hospice care is something that people can graduate from repeatedly, but also that anyone in this room could leave and be hit by a bus, as they exit the auditorium, I guess depending on how close the road is, right? But you also framed it as more than just an empirical uncertainty, but as an uncertainty about what quality of life means, that people might be surprised by what happens. Their depression might lift. They might have a touching moment. I'm curious, is this about preserving people's ability to buy a lottery ticket on how they die? Or is it a successful death, if those moments happen? Or if someone really listening to your speech going, well, I might be surprised, like my pain might lift, something good might happen, who isn't surprised, did they die in a lot of pain so that someone else could get a winning lottery ticket as they die? Or do you think that can still be a good death?
I mean, I think on a philosophical level, I have the presumption that dying in a lot of pain, as many people do, can be a good death, right? Yes, and that that the preparations that you make for death and the experience of death are not sort of just determined by whether you experience it in a particular way. That there's a range of good deaths and bad deaths that overlap to some degree with the amount of pain that people experience, but that can't actually just be charted on a maximum pain, bad death, minimum pain, good death, or maximum control, good death, minimal control, bad death. I think the landscape is more complicated than that. And I think it's that complexity in part that, again, in almost every other context of life, when we think about whether people should end other people's lives and whether people should end their own lives, we are not just sort of honoring a right to life, a sacredness of life, and so on, but we're also honoring complexity and uncertainty in the human future, right? The idea that you don't know in the end. You don't have the scale of knowledge to know on someone else's behalf exactly what the best death would be, which is why, and here we can agree, we should not have a euthanasia program, but you also may not have the capacity to know for yourself exactly what the best possible death would be. And again, I think this obtains in very clear ways in just how we think about younger people facing difficulties and challenges who have a desire to end their lives. The baseline assumption that we approach those people with is not, guess what, your life's gonna, if you just hang in there, it's definitely gonna get better. We can't know it's gonna get better, maybe it gets worse, right? What we're saying is you don't know enough to make the unique kind of choice that forecloses all other choices, right? And you could say, well, there is a certain circumstance where death is so imminent that no longer applies, but you could argue it the other way and say, actually, the person who is 45 is much more likely to be in a position mentally and physically where they actually can assess their situation. And the person who is confronting a terminal illness with all the suffering that it entails is more likely to be impaired, including in ways that are not going to amount to abuse on the scale of, a nurse gives you a fatal shot just in order to save some money on a hospital form, but might take the form of, toxic complexities within your marriage, toxic complexities in your relationships to your children that I do suspect show up in the American system, even if we've avoided the worst abuses.
This is a more libertarian pitch than I expect from you, because you're arguing about uncertainty, keeping open options, not making the choice that forecloses other choices. But you're a married man, and you married relatively young. You made a choice that foreclosed all other choices. I won't ask you to stake out a position on legal no-fault divorce, but as a Catholic, you made an irrevocable choice in the eyes of the church. And so,
not a choice that forecloses all other choices, just a choice that forecloses a suite of other choices.
But in many ways, it's the choices we make that take a lot of choices off the table that are fundamental to our character. And it's not that we want to avoid choices that narrow our future. We want to pick them carefully. Is this something where it's because it narrows it to nothing, that's the determining factor of why to treat this different than other narrowing of choices for the sake of choosing one thing strongly? Or is it something else?
No, I think, there's a lot of different arguments I could make, but to stick with this line of argument, I think there's a big difference between narrowing your choices. The narrowing of choices is essential to any human life, right? Every important thing we do automatically narrows our choices. But yeah, I do think that there is a pretty clear distinction between choices that reduce the set of choices that exist beyond that and choices that eliminate further choices altogether. But I would stress, it's not just choices that end all other choices, it's choices that end all future possibilities, all contingencies, in ways that, again, in order to feel certainty about those choices, you would have to assume a kind of godlike perspective on your own existence, which is something that no human being has. And again, I think it is at the very least debatable whether a person dealing with a terminal disease is closer to that perspective in any way than someone who desires to end their life at a different phase in life.
I think it's a bigger imaginative leap for most people to picture what a good death in agonizing pain looks like than to picture the death, whether it comes through medical aid or dying, or the death I think many people aspire to, which is with enough notice and enough cogency to be surrounded by my loved ones, and with kind of the peace of mind to address them, and then a quiet shuffling off. So could you give us a portrait of what you think it means to die well while suffering immensely?
I'm limited by the fact that I have not myself as yet died.
You expect it can be done, so what's informed your belief that it can be done?
Again, you want to tread carefully here, because that was a joke, but not a joke, right? I have not gone through this process personally, and I have had experiences of death, including terrible deaths from cancer and other illnesses in my life, but I have not been in a situation where I am a primary caregiver, right, for someone facing that kind of circumstance, unlike, people here are some of the examples you cited, right? So in that sense, my arguments are always going to be limited. I have, however, I have suffered personally from a fairly difficult and at times incredibly painful illness that inspired at various times suicidal thoughts. And I spent a certain amount of time in that illness as a member of a family who, as a father to a family, right, for whom all sort of ordinary enjoyment of everyday life was gone. Again, this is not analogous exactly to being in a hospital bed, sort of actually dying, and I'm not claiming that it is. But it does inform my thinking on it, so it's worth saying, right? That I have, for several years of my life, my capacities were totally diminished. I was a shell of myself, and I existed, primarily sort of through my relations and presence with my wife and children, in ways that thankfully that phase of my life ended. I improved. I got better. But I do think that sort of the experience of endurance and presence through suffering, certainly when I look back on it, and obviously, you have to have different views of an afterlife to conceive whether or not someone would ever look back on their own death, right? We can debate whether that's a possibility. But when I look back on those periods, the experience in my memory is not just unleavened horror, even though sometimes it was absolutely unleavened horror in the moment. And what I take out of the experience is the endurance of great suffering in a relationship with people that I loved. And I think that would be the goal of suffering your way through death in a profound way without a sense of full control over the moment of your actual departure. And again, you can say that that's fine because people I'm sure you would agree, people should be allowed to choose that approach, but people should also be allowed to choose I've gathered everyone around my bedside and I'm saying goodbye and ending it here. So I don't think making the case that a death of deep suffering can be a good death proves the case against medical aid in dying. But at the very least, it is necessary to make the case against it, to say that the alternative possibilities can have clear redeeming value.
And that's where I'd like to bring the question back to you, because in surveys of people seeking medical aid and dying, I think particularly in Oregon, because they've done it for so long, and been very good about keeping statistics, which I appreciate. The two most commonly cited reasons that people are seeking it are pain, but also the fear of burdening the people they love, which is a different, more subjective thing. And it sounds like it's a little bit what Ross is talking about as the gift here of the experience of burdening the people you love and experiencing their love through the worst, rather than thinking the best thing I can do for the people I love is remove myself from burdening them. And I know in a recent letter in response to some of the discussions and op-eds was a letter from someone who said that they really wanted to have the option of medical aid in dying because even if their family was willing to care for them, they couldn't live with the sense of having burdened them. And I'm curious, first of all, whether you think that's a legitimate reason in itself, right? For someone who's in hospice, they may or may not be in pain, but it takes a heavy toll on their family. Is simply saying, I don't want any more of this work to be done by the people I love, a reasonable reason to seek medical aid in dying.
Yeah, so I think what's important when you think about how one dies is that we center ourselves on what the dying person wants. And so when Ross talks about, yes, I can, you can have a good death through suffering, that is true if that's what the dying person wants. But our philosophy and what we believe morality is about allowing that person who's dying, they're in the very, very final stages of their life, allowing them to decide what's important to them, how much they want to suffer, who they want to be around them, what kind of death they want. And that ultimately, whatever the reasons are that they choose, it doesn't matter. It's about allowing them to go out on their own terms and having those final moments of completeness and closure. And that's ultimately what the medical aid and dying laws are all about.
I want to push back a little or ask, how much can this decision ever only be about one person, especially as they are surrounded by their loved ones? If I'm tending to my mother, in hospice, and she says, I'm doing all right for now, but I know you've had to take off work. I can't live with having burdened you. I'm planning to choose medical aid and dying. That's my expression of my values. And in the meantime, I'm pregnant, with hypothetically a baby with a life-limiting condition. Is it really possible for me to hear my mother say, the most important gift I can give you as a mother is not burdening you, and not hear her as commenting also on my baby?
So what I will say is what the studies show. So there were studies that were done in Oregon around the impact that medical aid and dying has on families. And what the studies all show is that medical aid and dying brings families together. That families finally come together, they have honest and open conversations about what's important, and that they are surrounding people. And there's a far greater sense of closure and completeness for those who go through the option of medical aid and dying than for other deaths. I had a grandfather who committed suicide. What happened in that experience was it tore the family apart. There was shame, there was grief, there was all kinds of anxiety around that death. A medical aid and dying death is nothing like that. A medical aid and dying death brings everybody together and allows people to have open and honest conversations about what the values and priorities are. And then ultimately what you see is an alignment forming through those conversations that take place.
Ross, it sounds
No. I want you. You need to harass me.
I wanted to ask a little bit about where you think a doctor should weigh in. Is medical aid and dying something a patient should ask about proactively and without prompting? Or is it something where, as a doctor says, you're entering hospice, you have a range of options. Some people in your condition choose to, take control of their own death. Is that something a doctor can say neutrally?
Yeah, so I think what's important is informed conversations, but doctors know their patients. And so what you want to see is the full range of options being offered to people, but not one option singled out. So I don't think a doctor should say, some people in your situation would choose the option of medical aid and dying. But what a doctor could say is, you're nearing the end of your life, and there are a range of options that are available to you now. Here are the range of options that are available to you, and I will support you with whatever option you'd like to choose.
Should doctors have a conscience exemption to not have to present the option? Because it does sound like once a doctor says that, it means it's a medical option, a Hippocratic option.
Yeah, so doctors in the law do not have to participate in medical aid and dying. They don't have to offer. They don't have to proactively offer. What we would like is for there to be a referral. If a patient proactively asks the doctor about medical aid and dying, we would love for them to refer to us, to the state website, to wherever would give people information about the option.
Ross, I'm curious, where you see this question of dying well interacting with American ideas about self-authorship. A lot of what's being described, which I think is what people want, is a sense of control and orchestration of death, something you can plan and make a gift to others. And again, your pitch is more, death is a roller coaster ride you get on, and your whole family gets on with you, and we'll see you when it stops, right? Where does the American idea of self-authorship to the end, all the way to the end of death, interact with the sense of what a good death looks like?
I mean, I think in terms of how it interacts culturally, I think it tends to increase people's sort of natural support for the idea. I think that's unquestionable, that there is a sense in which to the extent that we are the captains of our fates and the whatever Walt Whitmanian expression.
I guess actually let me put this differently. What would have to change in America for the states that have passed medical aid and dying to want to repeal it?
I mean, my actual assumption is that we would have to go deeper into what I see as the likely spillover effects of this kind of system, in order, and that in effect, the, again, very real safeguards that the US relative to other countries have maintained have encouraged what I think is again, a philosophically incoherent but sort of fairly politically stable view in those states of how the system works, where, again, to the extent that there are abuses, they are less likely to be the flagrant kind of abuse and more likely to be situations where the convergence of interests of family members is not an example of sort of harmony asserting itself, but of interests asserting themselves in ways that are perhaps not in the best interest of the person contemplating assisted dying, right? Again, sort of dynamics beneath the surface. I think there is a certain naive sentimentality in the view of family life that undergirds the system as it exists. But in any case, I think that to get a recoil, you need to have the system trespass further on what is the sort of counterforce to Americans' sense of agency and captaincy of their own souls, right? Which is the continuing awareness that most of the time it's wrong to kill yourself, right? And I do think you see the spillover to some degree already in the United States. I think that, we have a fair amount of evidence that suicide and suicidal ideation are contagious. I don't think it's a coincidence that as American society has become more accepting of medical aid in dying at the end of life, there has been a rise in both suicide and suicidal ideation for other phases of life. Again, not under the formal umbrella, obviously, of any kind of medical aid in dying system, but I think there is a cultural connection between those forces. But I think you would have to go substantially further for people to say, well, wait, actually this, very small exception that we've carved out does not actually hold as an exception. It spills over, it changes society in ways that we, generally still think are bad, because we generally do not think that even people facing unbearable suffering in most phases of life should end their lives.
I'm going to save one question for myself for later and turn it over to audience questions. So I'm looking for high hands, short to the point questions, and we're going to send someone around with a mic. You can address your question to either or both speakers, and speakers, I'll ask you to keep your answers brief because that allows me to take more questions.
Thanks. My name is Dan Diaz. I'm Brittany Menard's husband. So Brittany was doing everything she could to live as long as possible. Her hope was that she wouldn't need to utilize that medication. Her hope was that she would experience a death. Unfortunately, the pain at the base of her skull, pain that not even morphine could alleviate. She's on Dilaudid, that's 4 times stronger than morphine, some hefty doses. Inability to sleep for days on end. The seizures are what terrified her the most, and those were getting more frequent, more severe. So for her, it simply allowed her to take back that little bit of control from that brain tumor and experience a gentle death. I guess my question to you would be, and she was one making the decision from the day that she decided to apply for it, qualify for it, and then finally utilize the medication. We had that medication in the house for over 6 months. So the question, my question to you would be, if she doesn't utilize that, pick a number. Does she live another 10 days, 2 weeks? She's only suffering. And she could feel that. And so the question would be, what would you offer Brittany so that she doesn't have to experience or endure being tortured to death by that brain tumor? What's the alternative? What's the option? What's the remedy? What didn't we think about that she should use, if not for the option on the day that she decided, I've lived my life, I'd prefer to pass away gently now instead of experience what's coming next, blindness, paralysis, and it's not unlikely for a tumor that size to cause a stroke, and that's exactly what you would be stuck with. So what is your remedy, if not for that?
Thank you for your question, and also I just want to say thank you for attending a debate of a very personal part of your life and being part of hearing that debated. Ross.
So I'm not a doctor. I'm not a medical provider, right? So I don't have, there's no specific sort of pain management alternative that I am remotely qualified to offer you, and I would assume that you had the best medical care and that, whatever the best, within a reasonable range of pain management options you had, that you utilized them. I think being respectful of your story, the reality of the position that I'm defending is that it assumes that there are some forms of suffering that there is no remedy for, that there is no moral remedy for, right? And that in turn then imposes upon you and your spouse and potentially me at some point, or someone I love, forms of extreme suffering. Absolutely. And there's no way, there's no sort of story that I can ultimately spin around this that, is not, there is a reason, I think, that, again, acknowledging that there are ministers of the Christian faith and so on who support medical aid in dying, there is a reason that the strongest opposition to assisted suicide in its various forms comes from religious bodies, because there is a religious assumption that that there is sort of potentially a kind of cosmic meaning in suffering that is not readily apparent in the moment that you're going through it. But the laws of the United States do not necessarily need to be made with those kind of metaphysical assumptions in mind. I think the challenge is that again, I feel like, as in my back and forth on this stage, I feel like I'm answering questions with another question. I don't expect you to answer the question exactly. But I think the challenge for supporters of this kind of medical aid in dying is that there are in this life many, many forms, different forms, mental forms, physical forms of seemingly unbearable suffering that people go through. And the argument for the policy being defended on this stage is that there is a particular context in which someone experiencing a certain kind of agony has, it is not just acceptable but potentially admirable for them to end their own life with the assistance of someone else. And it is very, very difficult for me to define a principle whereby this particular kind of suffering is distinctive enough to justify an exception to a rule against ending lives, given that there are people who persist in various forms of suffering. You talked about 10 days, 3 months, 6 months. There are people who persist in forms of suffering for extended periods of time, who we do not offer this to. And I think the strength of my own argument here is the reason that the kind of barriers that are placed around aid in dying have a tendency to break down, and have not broken down that much in the United States, have broken down in other countries, because there are so many kinds of suffering, and so many people who can end up in a place of feeling tortured and feeling hopeless, who then say, why isn't this choice accessible to me? I think that's the essence of the argument that I'm making. But in terms of what I have to offer, I have nothing to offer but my deepest sympathies. I'm so sorry.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to the next question, just because otherwise I won't be able to take ones from other people in the audience, but thank you. I'll take one from all the way in the back. That's you.
I'm Jay Gill. Kim, you may remember my name. I've been supporting Compassion and Choices for the last 7-8 years. And I want to share with you an incident.
And I'm going to have to ask, is it a question or a
Yes,
story?
I
Okay.
would
Is it
like your comments on it. A friend of mine got up at night. He had, we call it postural hypotension, falls down, breaks his neck by hitting his head on the nightstand. He is paralyzed from neck down. Has good family, takes him to the hospital. Doctors ask him, do you want to be treated? Your chances of ever much improving the motility of your extremities is very low. He decides and tells his family, let me go. My question to you would be, would you support something like that? In that event, doctors here in California did, after 72 hours, give him something, and he gone to sleep. His family did not suffer. He had very healthy family, and he did not suffer. Who knows, he could have lived in wheelchair, somebody pushing him around for the next 5 years, 10 years. He was 77 already. So to me, in that situation, it was his choice, and that choice being available was the right choice for him. If you allow me, I could share with you another incident.
I think we'll only be able to do one,
Yes,
I want to
yeah.
take questions.
So,
from
Just-
so
Rachel.
that
Can
would
I-
be my
sorry,
question
can
to
I
you.
just-
What
can I
are your
just-
comments on a situation like that?
Can I just clarify? Is the issue that he refused certain kinds of medical treatment, or that you think the doctors gave him medication to hasten his death?
I believe he wanted to hasten his death, and he requested the doctor, and after proper waiting time, doctor did give him that. That's my belief. I'm not 100% sure.
And I think we can treat it, since neither of our participants has the full medical chart, primarily as a hypothetical, which kind of has two branches. I'll start, here with you, Kim, because I'm less certain what your answer is and more certain about Ross's. Where does declining care, when someone is not in hospice, but declining care that could be life-saving, fit into this model of choosing the manner of one's death? And where does the question of a doctor framing it that way as a choice fit into your model?
It's legal in every state for patients to be able to decline care, and it should be legal, and that is a constitutionally protected right. So any person should have the ability to decline medical treatment and allow a natural death to take place. In this situation, if the person requested and went through the formal process for medical aid in dying and got the prescription medication, then we would support that. However, if the doctor administered the medication on their own and it was not at the patient's request or they didn't go through the formal process, that would in California be a crime, and the doctor should be charged with that crime.
Thank you. We'll take a question. Yep. We'll just wait for the mics because that way you'll also be heard on the video.
Getting your exercise, huh?
Thank you so much for the perspective. My name is Ethan. I got my PhD in electrical engineering from here. When I came to this debate, I was very close to Ross' position. I'm still with his position for the case that I'm going to say, but I understand that your arguments are very compelling because in my mind, euthanasia is what happens in Canada, in Netherlands. I'm from Spain. My mom had a stroke. I'm terrified that people there that recently passed a euthanasia law, so I clarify. But even with that, I side with him because I'm going to offer you a case that is not, and it made me think. So in 2001, I have a very good friend of mine who was diagnosed with cancer. It was lung cancer, and he was given 6 months to live. And back then, in California, assisted living was not, assisted dying, whatever you want to call it, was not available. And a lot of the bad things that happened to somebody in that situation happened to him. Most of his people who thought they were their friends ran away. Very few of us stuck around. And here's what things that could happen. And I'm happy that California didn't have that option because he tried several treatments. Several of them worked here at Stanford. He lived 5 years more. In 2004, he became a parent. So if in 2001 that option had been available to him, and given all the pressure that he was going through, he was 32 at the time. It was like the examples that you gave. So Archie would not have been a father. His son would not be alive. He converted to the Roman Catholic Church in 2004. So a lot of great things happened because, here in California, we didn't have that. And given all the pain that he was going through, had he gone through the process, and here is the pill, his son wouldn't be alive today. He wouldn't exist. And I recovered my faith as a result of what he went through. I was an atheist. So a lot of things would not have happened if that option was available, because he was an atheist at the time. I'm pretty sure he would have taken the pill. And because it was not available, he didn't take the pill. The son was alive. I recovered my faith. So that's the question to you.
So I actually question the assumption that he would have taken the pill, because what the evidence and the data shows is that people will go through the process to get the prescription, and then just like Brittany Menard did, they hang on to that prescription and they put it in their cabinet and they wait. And it gives them, during that period of time, an incredible sense of control, and they start to live. So what a lot of people say is that prescription was all about my living, because now I know that if my suffering does become too great, I have an option. And then they continue to live their lives. And if treatments work, some people actually won't do that last experimental treatment until they get the option of medical aid in dying, because they want to know that if their suffering is too great, that they have that as an option. But people really hang on to it until the very, 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 very end, when their suffering is just too great. There's no, people aren't getting the prescription and rushing out and taking the prescription. They desperately want to live. They're still hoping for a cure. But it's about, the cases like Isla, who I told you about. I mean, there was no more hope for a cure for her. She was literally in her deathbed with doctors saying there's nothing left. What the studies show is that it eliminates the last, 4 days to a week of somebody's life. They're not taking it weeks and months and years before they're going to die.
But
go ahead briefly, Ross. Yeah.
But so again, I just don't quite understand the consistent principle that's being applied here, because essentially what we're saying is we are extending the option to end your suffering. I mean, you're essentially implying we want to make sure that people really want to live. They really still want to live when they get this option, right? But what is the principle whereby you are extending this option to someone who has 6 months to live and desperately wants to live, and you're like, don't worry, they'll only use it when things get really bad, but then you would deny it to take the gentleman's example, right? Let's say in the gentleman's example, the man had surgery and was confined to a wheelchair and had no mobility, but had 10 years, 20 years of life ahead of him, right? And said then, I'm in my right mind, I'm facing not the kind of, direct agony that your wife went through, but a kind of psychological, spiritual agony that most of us can't imagine. And I, in my right mind, want to die. Why isn't it a much more serious violation of individual autonomy to deny that man control in that situation than it is to give someone who wants to live this kind of, safeguard or fallback? And again, I'm aware that this argument, can talk us into, suicides all over, right? That is the risk that the skeptic of medical aid in dying takes, that, you make this case too well and you might not like where you end up. But I think that it is suggestive of the problem with the limits that you're trying to place. The limits are there because people intuit that, you don't want a sort of normalization of suicide, but the limits just don't really make any sense on their own terms.
Well, I'm going to use this as my opportunity to ask that last question, because I know we're pushing on time a little bit, and then you'll each have an opportunity to give summing up remarks. So I used to teach statistics to people who desperately didn't want to take a statistics class, and when I was pitching why they should do this, I didn't pitch that based on their GPA. I said, there's going to come a time in your life when someone you love is in the hospital, and a doctor is going to walk into the room, and they're going to say something that's very dense with numbers, and then they're going to look at you and ask you to make a choice. And I'm not going to rely on you remembering everything you learned in statistics that day. I just need you to learn enough in this class that when you hear that wall of numbers, you think, this is tractable, I can sit with it, and I can take better care of someone I love because I'm not going to turn off my ears when I hear numbers. I'm teaching statistics as end-of-life care. And I'll be honest, I'm only covering it there as an empirical matter. I want my students to be able to sort through just the facts of what's being put before them in terms of uncertainty. What I want to ask you both is what formation, we have a real range of ages in this room of people who may face this choice sooner for themselves, people who may face it sooner for a loved one. I think you've both talked in terms not just of resolving uncertainty or legal ambiguities, but you've talked about what it looks like to approach these decisions well. You know, Ross in terms of comfort with uncertainty, Kim in terms of people taking but not immediately taking the medication. I know you've got a pluralistic approach. You've kind of given a vision of what it looks like to do this well. What's the best thing besides take a statistics class that people in this auditorium could do to be prepared morally for the weight of this decision, to choose well regardless of what options are legally on the table?
Sure. I would say for everyone in this room that you should really think about your values and priorities as you're at the end of life. We have on our website at compassionandchoices.org an end-of-life planning guide. It allows you to go through your values and priorities and start thinking about what quality of life means to you. Everybody should fill out an advance directive. When my daughter was 18, she came downstairs and said, "Mom, today's the day." And we filled out her advance directive together. And I would encourage you all to do that. The most important decision that you can make with that is figuring out who you want to be your healthcare proxy. Because that's the person who will speak for you if you can no longer speak for yourself. Your proxy could not make the decision of medical aid in dying. That could only happen if you're still mentally capable. But in terms of preparing for the end, making sure you think about who do you want to speak on your behalf if you can't make that decision yourself is really important. And you want someone that's going to advocate for the choices that you would want and what's important to you. And you want to have conversations with your loved ones about what's important to you. Because if you look at the key stories around end-of-life care, many of the people that have been at the heart of this movement have actually been young. You have people like Anna Quinlan, you had Brittany Menard, and it was the unexpectedness of their death that had people realizing that death is the one inevitability of life. It will happen to all of us, and it's a question of when it happens to all of us. So really thinking through those are important, and our website has a ton of information to help people do that, and it's relevant at every age.
Ross, what should people attending tonight do in the next week or so to be better prepared to die?
Oh, you just narrowed the question. That's so unfair. In the next week or so?
I want them to do it.
I mean, I first, allowing for our profound philosophical disagreements, I endorse a lot of that advice. I don't know if you can do this in the next week. It depends on your circumstances. But the main thing I would add is that as with any aspect of life, going through adolescence, dating, having kids, anything else, there is no substitute for direct experience. And you can't sort of force direct experience exactly. Everyone is not going to go out and volunteer at a hospice. I've never volunteered at a hospice. All my experiences have come through people close to me dying or going through that phase of life. But there are just a lot of things that you don't know until you encounter them. And finding some way to have a personal encounter with extremity, ideally with someone you have a connection to. If you have an opportunity to be with a relative going through the dying process, you should take it. But there are other ways to have that encounter. Again, yeah, I think there's obvious value in seeking that out, because there is both the question of sort of what your values are, but also what your values are when they actually confront the experience itself, which may be somewhat distinct things.
And with that, we're going to move to the final phase of our debate, just 2-minute closing statements. It's a very short period to address a big topic, so whichever thought each of you would most like to leave us with. Ross, you have the first opportunity to respond.
Just you know, to go back to my attempted response to your question, the world is filled with terrible suffering of all kinds. And end-of-life suffering is some of the most terrible, but there are many, many different forms of terrible suffering that people go through. And maybe the chief realization that I've had going from age 20 to age 44 is just a greater sense of how much suffering in different forms stamps, you know, directly or indirectly every human life. And the reality of the position I'm taking is that, you know, it seeks, you know, wants to seek ways to reduce suffering, obviously. It wants to seek strategies for managing suffering. But in the end, it assumes that even the most profound forms of suffering are not a reason to deliberately end a human life. And I suspect, whatever your opinions on the end-of-life debate, that you agree with me about that for a very wide range of human experiences across the life cycle, young and old, rich and poor, mental health and physical health. And I guess my contention here tonight is that while the experience of dying is in certain ways obviously entirely unique, it is not unique in ways that generate an obvious and clear-cut exception to the rule that we follow with major depression, terrible chronic illness, consignment to wheelchairs, all manners of suffering. And and if you can't fully articulate a reason beyond intuition why, 6 months with a terminal diagnosis licenses something that would not be licensed to people facing other forms of equally terrible suffering, then I think in the end you don't have a clear-cut case for the distinctive morality of medical aid in dying. And in the end, the truth is that, whenever doctors give us the news, we're all dying. That's a kind of downbeat place to end, but there you have it.
Thank you so much. Kim?
So what I have seen in my work is that we are all one bad death away from becoming an advocate for medical aid in dying. I do think in life there is a tremendous amount of suffering. And what we have here in the United States is a very clear and compelling way that we can authorize the option of medical aid in dying and reduce suffering for people during the final months of their lives. And as a moral society, I can't imagine why, because suffering exists at other points in their lives, we would want to deny people on the way out the ability to control that suffering. When you look at the principles of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute of limited government, individual liberty, personal responsibility, and the rule of law in particular, medical aid in dying is absolutely in line with those principles. And when you look at Judeo-Christian principles, while absolutely within Catholic theology, medical aid in dying is immoral, but across the rest of the Judeo-Christian religions, what you see is a great recognition of the reality that how we die has dramatically changed in the past 100 years. People used to die of heart attacks, they used to die from disease, they died from diabetes, and medical advances have allowed us to extend and prolong life far beyond a natural death that was given to us by God. What medical aid in dying does is brings balance back at the end of life, and it allows us to continue to pursue medical advances so that we can have the longest life that's possible, while allowing us the option then, when we're at the very end and the pain is just too excruciating, to relieve that suffering. And when I think about what makes a moral and just society, it's about alleviating suffering through our public policies. And this is one that even Ross has acknowledged that here in the United States, the laws allow us to do that. So if we have laws that allow us to relieve end-of-life suffering, that, by the way, the data does not in any way support the idea that medical aid and dying laws have resulted in suicide contagion. So if the laws are not causing harm to anyone, why would we not allow those who want suffering, which is a perfect value for someone at the end of life if they want to endure suffering, but allow those of us who do not want to suffer at the end of life the option to take medical aid and dying? Because as Governor Brown said, this is an option that I imagine would bring profound peace of mind to me at the end of life. And while I don't know if I would choose the option, I do know that I wouldn't want to deny somebody else of that option. So thank you.
Thank you, Kim. I'd like to thank both of our debaters here, and I'd like to invite Micah from ISI to come up for some final housekeeping and next steps for people. But thank you just for a moment to both our debaters. Yes, that was your cue. I'd just like to thank the three people who had their hands up fastest, and I can see why, given how personally this issue has touched you. And I think the one thing that's a guarantee is that we expect this issue to touch everyone in this auditorium. Like death, it's just a question of when.
Let's give another round of applause just for the whole event. Thanks again to Kim and to Ross for coming here to debate, and thank you, Leah, for managing a wonderful debate, and to all of you for coming. Kim said that her position is aligned with ISI's principles. I'm sure Ross would say the same, but I can say that we're here to give you this platform and to allow you, our audience, to sit with these questions and to wrestle with them. So thank you again for coming. A couple minutes ago, if you registered online for this event, you received a message with a survey to take. We asked that you would take that, but for those of you who didn't, we do have the QR code here. Once you finish that, you're welcome to leave, and you're free to go, but do that first. And thanks again for coming. Enjoy the rest of your evening.